These are the new 7th generation Ford Mustang, and the good news is when it returns to Australia in late 2023, it will be far faster than the model it replaces. It will come with a V8 and a manual transmission. Let's check it out. Now, the more observant of you might have realised there's actually two Mustangs beside me. This car here is actually the 2.3 litre EcoBoost, and you can tell it's the EcoBoost because for the first time Ford will differentiate the styling. So if you have the 4-pot turbo, you lose out on the air intake there, but it actually is quite a nice minimalist look. Now, we originally thought the 7th generation Mustang would be all new and would migrate to the same platform that the current Ford Explorer is, but that hasn't been the case with this car. It actually still sits on the old S550. Why does that matter, John, you may ask? Well, it matters because it will miss out on electrification and Ford's next generation autonomous technology. Anyway, let's get back to this car. The 2.3 EcoBoost, smooth bonnet here. This grille is actually shaped like the original 1964 Mustang, which is kind of a cool little styling cue. Walk around the car a little bit here. It's a lot smoother. They've lowered the belt line as well for sort of more dynamic feeling. But at the back, you have these real muscle car arches, which is really quite cool. Almost forgot the headlamps. Now they have these 3 tri-bars here, which is another sort of nice cue to the sort of the trademark tri-bars, which are on the rear tail lamps. Now, if you come to the back, the Mustang definitely has a edgier, more aggressive styling, and that's because it has been workshopped. About 2 years ago, before COVID, the stylists here, they had 2 models. They had one very evolutionary design, and they had one edgier, more aggressive styling. Now, instead of bringing in the usual Mustang buy, they brought in millennials and Gen Z, whatever they're called, and apparently the younger audience preferred this edgier, more aggressive look, so this is what we've got. Okay, you might have guessed that we're now standing beside the V8 version, and as before, it carries over its 5-litre V8 Coyote engine. Now, Ford annoyingly hasn't told us what sort of power and torque figures that this car will produce, but it does have a new cold air intake and should be, well, considerably more powerful and more efficient than the engine it replaces. I'm hedging a bet at around 350 kilowatts and around 560 Newton meters of torque. Now, let's go back to the styling differences. So we have the hood extractor here, and if you look at the grille, same shaped grille, but it has this gloss black sort of effect here, which looks like it makes it a little bit wider. But it has these 2 nostrils here, and that sort of feeds cold air into the air intake. Other changes is it's got slightly different air intakes beneath. And this way, at the back of the car, we have a larger diffuser, and we have these cool quad tailpipes. If you have the 4-pot, you only get dual pipes. So within the Mustang, you have to remember that this car, again, is trying to attract younger buyers, and that explains why there's not actually that many retro design cues in here, other than perhaps some of these vents over here. And the dash is actually dominated by this large, I think they call it a continuous screen. So it has a 12.3-inch digital instrument cluster there that's joined by a 13.2 infotainment system that lives behind a 1-piece glassing. It's kind of cool because it has some really, really neat graphics, including replicating the display from a Fox body Mustang, which for geeks like me, I just think that's so cool. But otherwise, I mean, it doesn't really shout Mustang when you're in here. Other things to point out, there is a new flat bottom steering wheel and this thing here, which is actually, looks like a parking brake or a handbrake, but is actually a drift brake. So when you're in track mode, it helps you drift. I know. Can you imagine how many cars are going to be binned because of this little lever right here? So since the Mustang's on the old platform, it shares the old car's suspension, although it has been heavily modified. So on the front there's struts, and on the back, remember, it's an independent rear suspension, so it has some multi-link rear suspension. Right, brakes wise, this particular car, this has the performance pack, so this has the 6-piston Brembo brakes, and there's also 4-piston Brembo brakes on the rear axle. Now, higher grade models will also come with the option of the MagneRide adaptive dampers, which are pretty handy, but probably not really cutting edge technology nowadays. So just to remind you again, the V8 comes with a 6-speed manual or the 10-speed automatic, while the 4-pot EcoBoost, you only get the 10-speed automatic. Performance-wise, again, Ford will not release that until, well, probably later this year, but we think this car should be capable of a 0 to 100 kilometers per hour time of around 4 seconds and a top speed of 270 kilometers per hour. Now, this car should be available in Australia in late 2023, and when it arrives we think that pricing will begin at around $55,000 for the very cheapest 2.3 litre EcoBoost versions, but for the V8 we expect a price tag, well, of in excess of more than $70,000.